Pure tariff chaos. On February the 20th, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that President Trump overstepped his powers when imposing tariffs last April under the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. Trump called the decision ridiculous and responded by immediately announcing a new 10% global tariff, citing a different law, and he has threatened to raise that tariff to 15%. But the new tariffs can only remain in place for up to 150 days without congressional approval. Now, the latest developments have added new uncertainty to global trade and business confidence. So, three big questions. What does this policy whiplash reveal as the loopholes in the U.S. political system? How to navigate the great mess that's called U.S. tariff policy, and with U.S. tariff rates up in the air, where is global trade heading next? Welcome to this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Beijing by Professor Ying Xiaopeng, Dean of the Research Institute for Global Value Chains at the University of International Business and Economics. From Jakarta, Indonesia, by Professor Bert Hoffman of the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore. From Houston, U.S., David Firestein, CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations, and from Portland, U.S., by Liang Yan, Kremer Chair, Professor of Economics and at William Mett University. The warmest welcome to all of you and happy Year of the Horse. To start off, help us understand exactly what is going on here. Now, Professor Liang, let me go to you. What weakness is in the U.S. political system are we seeing for this particular moment, or will you call it strength?
Yeah, good to be with you, Liu Xin, and panelists. So I think this whole mess really started with, Donald Trump's, when he took office, he imposed this very sweeping tariff on friends and allies and also adversaries and competitors. The so-called Liberation Day tariff, and that is basically based on the 1977, the so-called IEEPA, as you mentioned. So this is the both reciprocal tariff, but also the so-called fentanyl-related tariff, and that accounted for about 70 to 75% of the U.S. tariff. Now, last Friday, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down the imposition of tariff based on this law, arguing for pretty much that this law does not allow the United States president to impose tariffs, which is a form of tax. This is basically a law that was passed in 1977 as in the Cold War, as an extension and vision of an earlier, the so-called Trading with Enemy Act, which basically is to allow the president to regulate trading with adversaries, right, like the Cold War countries, especially when it comes to freezing assets or sanctions or banning imports altogether from these countries. It does not allow the president to impose taxes or duties or tariffs in that regard. And the Supreme Court also argue, to tax is really a power of the Congress. So unless the Congress delegate this to the president does not have the power to impose all these sweeping tariffs. So I think that is the reason why they struck down this tariffs. And of course, as you mentioned, in response, instead of reset or rethink the entire trade policy, what Trump has done is basically double down on his commitment of using tariffs, using the Section 122 of the 1974, the Trade Act. And of course, in the meantime, as we know, this tariff only applied for 155 days at 10% unilaterally and also uniformly on all the trading partners. And so he's got 150 days for him to think about other alternatives. And he hinted that he might investigate into Section 301, and which is to do with unfair trade practices, but also Section 232 of the 1962 Act, which is to look at the so-called national security concerns.
So a lot of details there, but by and large, the Supreme Court has ruled that President Trump's tariffs on countries around the world, which he launched last April, are not in line with the law. But David, let me come to you. Do you see the system working? Because it's almost a year, right? Great chaos has unfolded involving almost every major trading partner of the United States. A lot of money has been lost, a lot of uncertainty created, and now the court came out with this ruling, yet it doesn't seem to put an effective brake on President Trump's tariff zeal. Is there something not functioning in the system?
Well, I think from the outside, it often looks that way. But from the standpoint of the U.S. system itself, the political system and our constitutional, the elements of our government, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary, the system is working the way it is intended to work. The president can make policy initiatives. In some cases, Congress needs to be involved. In this case, the Supreme Court, the issue was challenged in the courts, and the argument was made that the president was usurping congressional authority that was properly vested in the legislative branch and not the executive. It made it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court made a ruling. Interestingly, 2 of the 6 justices that supported the striking down of these tariffs were appointed by President Trump. So it suggests that the system is working in the sense that issues are aired out, constitutional questions are raised, adjudicated, and ultimately, if and as necessary, decided by the Supreme Court. And that has forced the President of the United States to take a different approach to tariffs. The issue of whether tariffs are good or bad for the United States is a policy question, but the issue of constitutionality has, I think, been settled. And that's why the constitutionality of the president using this particular law, IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that has been settled. The president seems to be accepting that outcome, even though he doesn't like it. But you're exactly right, Liu-Shin, when you point out that it creates an overall chaotic effect from the standpoint of policy. And it is very messy. It generates volatility, unpredictability, instability, inconsistency, and a chaotic overall situation. And that is problematic for the United States and problematic for the world. But from the standpoint of the U.S. system, yes, I think the U.S. system is functioning at the moment the way it's supposed to be functioning.
However, I want to stay with David, because you're saying, the system is working well, but can it find those who overstep their powers accountable? Where does that accountability come from? Honestly, obviously, President Trump is okay. He invalidates these tariffs and then he moves on. So, what about the losses that have been created? Who will compensate? Who will compensate the potential? Those who have suffered potential losses.
Well, I mean, that's a great question, and it's a question that the Supreme Court, in its own decision, didn't address directly, basically remanding that matter to lower courts and other agencies to determine how to deal with the refund of these tariffs that have been collected. By the way, taxes on the American people that have been collected from the American people, how to refund those. It's going to be a messy process. It's going to take some time to figure out, but ultimately, the revenues generated by the tariffs are going to need to be returned and refunded to the people that paid them. And that's the American importers and ultimately, in most cases, the American consumers. That is going to be an incredibly difficult and complex task from a policy standpoint to achieve that, but that's who should rightfully get those refunds. If those individuals don't end up getting those refunds, then they're the ones, the American importers and consumers, are going to end up being the ones that pay the price for these foolish policies and unconstitutional policies. But that's something that's going to be sorted out over the coming months and beyond. And as you know, with our legal system, these matters can be tied up for certainly months and in many cases years. And we're going to be dealing with a messy, very challenging legal process and policy environment with a lot of question marks, a lot of volatility, a lot of possibility for lurching shifts from one position to another. And it is very problematic from the standpoint of the global trading system and from the standpoint of the United States economy.
Of course. Professor Hoffman, let me come to you. It's just so difficult to fathom that because of the wanton issuance, use of power, in this case, the unconstitutional use of power by one government, the whole world was kind of, swept off its feet. And then a lot of negotiations, a lot of discussion, a lot of money, and not just U.S. importers and consumers, I would say, because sometimes the tariffs may have been shared by, I don't know, the exporting side. I don't know. What is your take on this, Professor Hoffman?
Well, first, the evidence is that actually the exporters did not carry much of the burden of the tariff. Most of it was carried by importers, and they're starting to pass that on to consumers. But most of that has been basically absorbed by those that import. There's been a lot of effects of the tariffs. There's been a lot of trade diversion away from high tariff countries to low tariff countries. China was one of them. They used Southeast Asia, if you want, as a springboard to avoid some of these tariffs. And that might unwind now because now everybody is looking at the same tariff. Not 15%, but 10%, by the way. Yes, Donald Trump said it was 15%, but the announcement by the Commerce Department now says 10%. The uncertainty, though, that it has created in the past and that we're still facing, I think is really quite damaging. It's damaging for the U.S. because would you want to invest if you really rely on tariffs to protect you against foreign competition? But also internationally, would you want to invest in, say, a country where I now live, in Indonesia? It might not be competitive if tomorrow it has 20 or 25% or 30% taxes. So it's a very difficult situation. The economic damage of that uncertainty is quite large.
And it just goes like that. I mean, if something is broken, if something is damaged, a lot of, not to talk about the emotional trauma that this policy has cast on not just business people, but also journalists, for us, it just, okay, that's it. Let's move on. I mean, there's got to be people who ask this question. How come this was not deliberated beforehand, that it could be unconstitutional, and therefore be careful before you announce this, right? It's like, I do, and then we'll see. If I break the law, okay, but...
So look, don't forget the economists that need to rethink all of the impact every time something changes. But look, Donald Trump has been in love with tariffs for all of his life. He says tariffs is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. He called for large tariffs on Japan and Saudi Arabia back in the 80s. And he just thinks that it's the most wonderful tool of policy. Economists and most people disagree, but that's in a way the way it is. What is missing now is an active WTO, the World Trade Organization. Normally, countries can complain at the WTO and get a settlement and then basically get compensation if those tariffs are against the WTO framework. Right now, and that's because of actions of the United States, the appellate body, the body in which complaints are ultimately settled, is not functioning. And therefore, there's very little recourse against the tariffs that the US imposes. The only thing, and China has done so, the only thing that you can do is to hang in tough and to oppose it and basically counter it. Very few countries have done that. Most countries have actually settled for whatever the United States imposed and try to make a deal. Interestingly enough, some of those deals now carry higher tariffs than the ones that are currently have been announced and implemented, the 10% point. Yeah. Malaysia is one case, Indonesia is a case. So it's still very messy, and the EU is waiting for it because they have also had a 15% tariff in their draft deal. So maybe that will fall apart as well.
Indeed, a lot of economies have paused their negotiation to reach a trade deal with the Trump administration, but still, it just feels like the whole year of hustle, a lot of topic discussion, yelling at each other back and forth, seems to have been built on Sandy Foundation. Professor In, let me come to you. Now, China has said that it is studying the situation. It is thinking about how to respond before the next steps can be taken, understandably. From China's perspective, how do you think China can possibly react to this very precarious situation?
Well, I think the China's they didn't have any official response, just very short announcement, and they say they will do more further research. But personally, I don't think that China will be response too much because the basic
Sorry.
thing here is Donald Trump definitely want to keep the high tariff there, like globally, but China is much higher than that because they have several tariffs the plus together. China's actual tariff will be charged is more than 30% actually. It's maybe 40% actually. So for China's point of view, it's high enough. We suffer high enough. So you change the legal basis and also increasing from 10 to 15%. It doesn't matter. It's a small change for China. So I don't think so. But the for long term, they probably have something change because U.S. policy is we will say is one thing is uncertainty because all the like you say is move the back and forth, and also they will keep the higher tariff will be definitely will be hurt to the importer, and for China as a major exporter, they pretty care about the importer situation. So that way, for long term, they will suffer. So they probably have redistribution between industry and between countries, especially like for China point of view, for agricultural machinery industry and some and other labor intensive industry, they will be hurt more than before actually. And one more thing here is about Donald Trump said increasing from 10 to 15%. That is like a kind of a global tariff. That probably will be increasing base for all of the tariffs the imposed before. So that would be stop for most of things. Yeah.
One technical detail which is slightly confusing. So when he talks about the 10 to 15%, let's say 10% for the sake of simplicity, does that mean 10% additional tariff on all the tariffs that's already there or replacement?
The U.S. the administration right now is a 10% is a base the basic the tariff for all of countries, and then plus something more. Something more is like Fintani tariff they charge China like the 20% and 10%, and they also add other tariff for particular industry. They focus on the side from 301. So the everything plus together, but base is 10%. Right now, base is 15%. Yeah.
I see.
So for whole world increase.
Professor Liang, do you agree with that calculation? And if so, how can businesses navigate this very uncertain period of time? Because 10% or 15% Section 122 under the 1974 Trade Act is only about 150 days without congressional approval. Going forward, how can businesses manage this great uncertainty?
Right. So my understanding is that the IEEPA is what allowed the president to impose both the fentanyl-related and reciprocal tax. So that is now gone. So what is replacing that is the 10% base, 120, the Section 122 tariff. Trump has talked about to raise that to 15%, but so far the Customs and Border Protection is receiving the order of imposing 10% based on the executive order.
Right.
So I think that is the baseline that we're looking at. So definitely, for some of the high tariff countries like Brazil, China, India, they're seeing a reduction of their tariffs compared to under IEEPA. Now, when you're talking about the uncertainty, absolutely. I think even Section 122, now there are many economists are debating whether or not that is really, as Donald Trump called it, legally tested, because the United States doesn't really have a so-called balance payment, large and serious balance payment deficit. It does have a trade account deficit, but that's not the same to say that there's not enough private financing to allow this trade deficit to happen, and the U.S. is losing foreign exchange reserves, or the dollar is facing depreciation pressure. So there is still legal challenge to that. But when it comes to countries' responses, I think, first of all, if the countries that have struck trade deal with Trump, as we mentioned earlier, like EU or South Korea or Japan, they had a 15% rate during the trade negotiations. So now, they have to rethink. If the global rate now becomes 10%, and they, after all the concessions, are facing 15%, right? What would be the next step? Of course, they wanted to renegotiate, but of course, Trump would threaten to impose the Section 301, right? The unfair trade practices investigation. And so that put them in a sort of a conundrum, whether or not what they should do next. So I think for most countries right now is to really take a wait and see approach. For example,
what about
the EU has paused to ratify. Yeah.
Sure. A lot of countries can do that. But David, let me move on to you, David. For small businesses, it's going to be a much more difficult situation. What would be your advice to them? How can they survive this? Or maybe they have to change their mentality and thinking, okay, uncertainty is the new normal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it very much is an uncertain environment. I mean, things could change tomorrow. Things could change 36 hours from now with this president. He has a tendency to lurch from one position on an issue to another, from one tariff rate to another, sometimes within 24 hours, sometimes one day to another. It is an inherently uncertain environment. The fact that these issues are going to be continue to be challenged in United States courts is going to lend additional unpredictability to how these things are going to play out. As was noted, even the new tariffs are likely going to be subjected to legal challenges. They may end up being struck down. They may not be struck down. The bottom line, Liu Xin, is I think it's very clear that small businesses, medium, larger companies are all going to have to factor in to their thinking and strategy the idea that we're simply not going to have definitive clarity on the overall tariff regime and overall trade regime in the world for some period of time to come. And they're going to have to make decisions based on imperfect information as to what's going to happen tomorrow, the next day, or 2 months from now, or 5 months from now. And it's just a very volatile and difficult situation to plan in, and people are going to have to take that into account. So there's no easy answers. We have an X factor. That X factor is a guy named President Donald Trump, and any given day he can wake up and fundamentally change U.S. policy. And I think we're going to have that unpredictability and instability, policy instability, for a long time to come.
Wow. Professor Hoffman, do you also agree with this assessment? How best can people, relatively speaking, equip themselves or find some ways to survive this period of time?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things. I'm sure some companies, some large companies, they will actually move to the United States as Donald Trump wants, because that would give some benefits if they are truly only focused on the US market. Second, a lot of companies will look elsewhere and see, well, where can I sell my stuff instead of the United States? And we've seen a fair amount of that over the past, not just the past year, frankly, over the past decade already. Third, what you do see is a lot more intensity of trade between countries outside the United States. So there's groupings forming outside the United States. Asia Pacific is a very strong one. Europe is a very strong one, maybe now increasingly joined by Canada. So new communities of trade are forming that frankly leave the United States behind a little bit, which is a loss for the United States. They'll be facing higher prices and less technological progress, but that's a price to pay for the tariff policies of Trump. Beyond Trump, I think, well, first and as David already said, it's very important that the system held. So the constitutional system held, and that's a very important message. It actually reduces the uncertainty to some extent. But second, we need to think beyond Trump, because Mr. Trump won't give the use of tariffs, and no matter what, he'll find a way. But beyond that, we need to. I think there might be some calming down, a more rational government with respect to the international position of the United States and tariffs, and that would therefore give renewed hope of world trade and integration.
But honestly, Mr. Hoffman, if I may ask you very quickly, do you think the tariffs have, to a certain degree, achieved the goals that President Trump set out to achieve when he came into office?
No, they have not. No, they have not, and they will not. And that's why the Section 122, it will not reduce the overall balance of payment. It will just make it more expensive and may even increase the balance of payment deficit. But it won't achieve the goal. It's the internal balances in the U.S. savings and investment imbalances that drive the current account and the deficits.
Okay. Well, one last question to Professor In here. How have Chinese companies been coping with the great uncertainty? Professor In, help us understand, and will they be continuing or intensifying that effort? Please, 1 minute, please.
Okay. Yeah, I think Chinese company, one thing for Chinese manufacturing is pretty developed, and the flexibility is relatively pretty high. So I believe the Chinese manufacturer will be adjusted according to the final results. We're still waiting for final results because we don't know this one. It seems some good news to China because, relatively speaking, it's increasing. It's like there's a basic, we call basic or global, the tariffs one from 10 to 15%. Will be give some advantage, relative advantage to China, because China suffer very high the tariff. So relatively speaking, the tariff difference is not so big, a little bit smaller. So that is good news. But this bad news is the still says uncertainty. And I think it's a very important question is also most controversial question is whether this tariff rate will be changed based on the established or agreed trade agreement with other countries, because they signed every agreement already, and also with China. So we don't know this way. But based on Chinese manufacturing, I think that they were pretty flexible to adjust the production and investment to some other industry which is most favorable to China.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, David, 30 seconds to you. And before we wrap up, who do you think is potentially winning out of the situation besides President Trump?
Well, it's not clear to me that President Trump is winning. I think
he can claim,
I think
maybe.
He and his party are going to pay a price for the economic incompetence that they've displayed with these tariffs and the way that they're harming the United States economy. Let me just mention very briefly one important fact. The 5 largest U.S. goods deficits with the world as a whole occurred in 2021, 22, 23, 24, and 25 under these policies, including this past year. The largest deficit the United States ever had with the world as a whole occurred in 2025 under these policies. And by the way, President Trump, during his 5 years as president, his first term plus this last year, the United States in those particular 5 years lost 800,000 manufacturing jobs, according to the Trump administration itself. Right. So to the point that was made by Professor Hoffman, these policies aren't working. They're not working for the United States, for the American people. And at some point, the Republicans are going to pay a political price for this level of economic incompetence.
We have to leave it there. We'll wait and see. Many thanks to Professor In Xiaopeng, Bert Hoffman, David Firestein, and Liang Yan for your valuable insights. Thank you very much. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.